Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I think you'll agree that the sting that I walked onto is an absolute credit to our design team. It looked absolutely amazing. However, next year I would like the International Space Station as my walk-on. Absolutely amazing. Anyway, welcome back. Second session of the Private Wealth Forum 2022. We now have our panel discussion, which will discuss family offices for the future. I'd like to welcome Catherine Moore onto the stage, who is our moderator for this second session, together with our esteemed team of expert panelists. Thank you very much, and over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Rupert, for that kind introduction. I am delighted to be moderating today's panel of fantastic UK and Guernsey-based practitioners. On the stage with me are Sophie Ward, Michael Betley, Russell Clark, and Eric Martineau-Fortin, who will be discussing, within the context of this year's forum, the latest trends within the global private wealth sector, assessing how families and investors are currently engaging with issues and how, as practitioners, we can assist in solving them. Sophie joins us from HSBC Private Banking, where she is Head of Charities and Education, working with charitable organisations on their investments and specialising in how to weave sustainable and ethical requirements into their portfolios. Sophie has been with HSBC for over 12 years and holds a certificate in ESG investing from the CFA Institute and is a chartered wealth manager. Michael is managing director and a founder of Trust Corporation International, an Korean company, assisting wealthy families and financial institutions in developing wealth management and estate planning strategies. Michael was previously a private client partner at Woodlake Bell in Guernsey and is a chartered director with a significant executive and non-executive directorial experience. He's a member of a number of industry societies, including STEP, and has worked with We Are Guernsey, including having been a board member of Guernsey Finance LBG until recently. Russell is managing partner at Carey Olsen and heads up the private wealth team in the firm's Guernsey office. He advises both contentious and non-contentious trust and private wealth matters and has a significant succession and estate planning practice. He is a STEP member and, having been involved with the STEP branch for a significant number of years, has also been a member of the International Academy of Estate and Trust Law and the Association of Contentious Trusts and Probate Specialists. Eric is founder and managing partner of White Star Capital, a global multi-stage technology investment platform that invests in entrepreneurs building ambitious international businesses. They operate out of the US, Europe, and Asia, which allows businesses to scale internationally. Eric has over 20 years of investment business banking and venture capital investment experience, and prior to founding White Star Capital, he was co-founding member and partner of a transatlantic investment boutique firm and has also worked as an investment banker with BOA Merrill Lynch in New York and London, as well as ABN AMRO in Paris, London, and Amsterdam. Now, taking advantage of the notable background and experiences of our panelists today, might I suggest that we start by setting the scene? So, Michael, could you perhaps set the scene for the discussion today? What are some of the key challenges that you've been seeing with high net worth and ultra high net worth clients in the present environment?
Thanks, Catherine. I think what would be really helpful is just sort of set the scene, as you've said, in terms of the context of what we're seeing as trustees and as wealth planners. There are a number of what I would call super themes that we'll all be familiar with, that a number that we'll be discussing later on as part of the panel discussion, I'm sure. The whole mass transfer of wealth between generations, the digitalization and all of what that means in terms of how we interact together, Security is again a common theme, as is the climate. But when you add in perhaps the more post-pandemic issues, we've now got conflict in Europe, which exacerbates not only the movement of people, we've got mass migration, but yet a shortage of labor. It also comes with cyber risk. We've had the international community reacting very swiftly with sanctions policies. Never before have we seen quite so much change within such a short period of time. We've then got the levelling up that we're seeing not just here in the UK, but around the globe, as disparity between the wealth becomes even more obvious. So putting that into the context of what was an international free movement of trade that we were used to, free movement of people, now we've got hard borders, we've got within this regionalization, we've got views about regimes and sanctions to support those that are considered to be bad regimes. So putting that into the context of some of the families that we represent, it is, well, actually, where is their place in a sense of where's their residency? Are they tainted by association? It comes back to sort of reputational risk too. So we're certainly seeing a flight to parents wanting to make sure that they can find passports and homes for their kids so that they do have what perhaps we've enjoyed, which is this sort of free movement or free availability to go to a university abroad. You know, you look at perhaps the US now, where many of the universities were populated with Chinese students or Russian students. The take-up today, this year, you know, clearly it's a different changing demographic. So I think our clients, or many of our clients, are finding their place and trying to work out actually where they want to be. And amongst all of this continues to be that theme of security and understanding how to communicate. Again, that's one of the sort of the super themes that we've got. So I think ultimately it's also, I think this is a theme we'll probably come back to, it is ensuring that in the current climate, a purpose is well understood. And I think that those are some of the really knotty themes that are very difficult and are going to be different between each of the relevant families. Yeah.
And I think we'd probably all agree that we haven't seen a time quite like this. So many issues arising in what is really quite a short space of time. And from a legal perspective, Russell, how have you seen that translate in your discussions with your clients?
Well, I wonder whether Michael has been comparing notes, because I think that the issues that our clients are facing are probably the same issues that wealthy clients have faced for generations, but never before in such a sort of heated environment where there is just so much instability. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to talk about the challenges that families with a Russian connection have, because I think those are well documented and understood. I think there are probably a lot of people in this room and private client advisors around the world who probably know far more about the sanctions regime now than they did in February. But certainly the mobility is something that we recognize. I think wealthy families now are increasingly mobile. I think that's partly led by the transparency agenda. And I think you've got the sanctions regime as a result of what's going on in Ukraine, combined with countries fearing tax leakage in circumstances where they've had some unexpected expenses that are very substantial. I think those things are combining to lead to this renewed interest in the transparency agenda. It comes as no surprise that you've got the register of overseas entities in the UK, you've got similar regimes in Italy and elsewhere. I think compliance with these regimes, because they're all slightly different, it brings challenges. But I think for some families, the whole notion of transparency is a challenge. However, I think for most families, I think that they just recognize that that is a way of life now, and that the balance of privacy on the one hand and transparency on the other is going to shift. And I think picking up that reputational point, Michael, that you mentioned, we are seeing people migrate their trusts, companies, family offices, and themselves to places where they feel safer, regardless possibly of the tax consequences, which is something I'll come on to. I think that a lot of people have moved to the US because it's perceived to be a safer place to be, a place that's safer for investing and raising capital. And the challenge for service providers and advisors is the complexity around that and making sure that they remain compliant. I think a perennial theme is succession planning. And there's no doubt to me that that COVID-19 was a trigger event. I think lots of people think about succession planning, but it's one of those things that is always at the bottom of the to-do pile. Mm-hmm. People who are busy making money, enjoy making money, and they enjoy running their businesses, and they or enjoy investing, and they spend time doing that. Contemplating your own mortality is something that people don't often actually like to sit down and spend time thinking about. It's normally a birth, a death, a divorce, or a sale of a capital event, something like that, that triggers people to think about succession planning. And I think COVID-19 was such an event. And because people were locked down, they were forced to spend time, possibly with their families. They were forced to spend time, and I think people took time to either implement succession planning regimes or to dust them off and look and see whether they're still fit for purpose. So we were very busy dealing with, at one end, clients getting wills in place and what have you, and at the other end, setting up family offices and the purpose trusts and the foundations and the trusts that go around that. I think that the lockdown also gave people an opportunity to reflect on what their wealth is actually for. I think we spend so much time, if you're a wealth generator, you spend so much time generating your wealth that you possibly don't spend quite enough time thinking about why you're doing it, and preparing the next generation for the responsibility that comes with managing with wealth. Because if you don't prepare, I think my contentious background, if you don't prepare the next generation for those responsibilities, your legacy is often more of a burden than a blessing. And that preparation necessarily involves communicating with the next generation. And if that next generation are Gen Z and the millennials, I think perhaps more so than any other generation in the past, they are expecting to be heard as well as being told what the story is. They have a view and they want to be heard. And that can come, it's quite difficult sometimes in some families because the dynamics are such that families sometimes choose to not have those discussions because they know it's going to lead to conflict. Some families that we're advising are asking the existential questions. What does it mean to be a member of this family? What do we expect from people in this family? What are the privileges that being in this family offer? And what are the duties and responsibilities? And there's certainly growing interest in family constitutions, whether that's a written constitution or having a discussion about these sorts of issues as part of the succession planning conversation. We're seeing families, rather than having a lot of once the basic needs of the next generation and successive generations are catered for, what is the wealth for? And so we're seeing some families trying to use that money to create like a private family merchant bank, as it were, where families who have good, or family members who have good investment decisions can come and seek advice and get inexpensive capital for that business, but in the expectation that that money will then be repaid when the business is a success for the greater good of the family, as opposed to just that money being available for ostentatious consumption. So for those who are old enough, people are not wanting to create Dudley Moore in Arthur. They're wanting to facilitate families being able to build something of their own. And we're also seeing a lot of clients genuinely looking at philanthropy. Or certainly they were at the time of the pandemic. People were actually giving money away. And we're seeing families who have reflected upon their success and who are looking to create something that will have a lasting positive legacy for their family. I don't know, I know we're going to talk about ESG later, but I did just briefly want to mention that we've recently amended the Guernsey charity regime. So we brought our charities law up to date. We've moved away from the traditional PEMSL definition of what is charity, so it's much broader. Advancement of race relations and, importantly, environmental protection and that sort of thing is now covered by our charities regime. And the old regime of manumitted organisations, those are charities that were administered by licensed fiduciaries, not having to register. That's gone now. If you've got a charity that has £100,000 or more in capital assets or an income of more than £20,000 a year, and you're raising money from the public, you do need to register. If you're an international charity, you also need to register. And the idea is to give people greater confidence that donors who donate to charities will have confidence that the charities will be doing what they say they're doing.
And actually, one of the common themes out of quite a few of the points that you've made, Russell, is this question of good governance, whether that's good governance within a family and the family structure, and how the structure will continue even after the person who originally set it up is no longer around. How do you play within the rules that they may have set up? But also, good governance is seen in our philanthropy and the changes to the charities law. Good governance is one of the key issues that they were trying to address in bringing that change in. You've mentioned the sort of contentious side of it as well. What do you think, Sophie, perhaps, what happens if good governance is not in place, when it's been overlooked? What can be the risks involved?
So I think without good governance, things begin to fall apart. You might begin to get family arguments. You begin to see fiduciary risk. So if we take it back a step, a family needs to be communicating properly and planning properly around this governance. We saw it with Tim earlier with the space shuttle. Communication is key in all of this. Because if one generation of the parents they have one vision of the future and their children in the next generation have a very different vision, then when the parents die, the structures that may be put in place may be entirely inappropriate for what the next generation wish to do. And we see this particularly with business ownership transition and business ownership risk. If the head of the family passes away very unexpectedly and they haven't prepared the children or found a successor or agreed how a sale process might happen, then all of a sudden the business is left without someone at the helm. The work of the founder may have been over many decades, may be at risk of being lost if appropriate succession planning isn't put in place. So governance needs to start very early. I would say great to hear from Russell that his clients are beginning that process more readily, because without it, the family won't have an agreed path forwards for when you have pinch points. And again, this year is another pinch point for many families. what's happening to the business as a result of interest rates, as a result of inflation. And so at the moment, we're testing structures that are in place already, which is, while it's not great news, it's a great, for this one scenario, it's a great thing to be able to test those structures. And you then also have the risk of a family falling apart if siblings feel that they're not treated equitably or fairly. You may have one person involved in the family business and the others aren't, either by choice or they're not an appropriate person to be involved. How do you balance out how people not feeling hurt? What if someone else that they see as getting more wealth than them, or someone who's been very involved feel their siblings are leeching off them? And good governance and planning also enables you to depersonalize things. So prenups are a really great example. Just families start discussing prenuptials when children are in their early 20s. It removes the risk of a prenup only being in place because of that particular partner. So having governance, having flexibility. So Guernsey structures are very renowned for giving a good level of flexibility. The investment fund and the foundations that have been launched in the last few years gives enough flexibility to let people forge their own path without creating tensions and everyone knowing what their place in the family is going to be going forwards.
I suppose flexibility is really key, because as much as obviously with succession planning and even putting in a form of good governance, what you're trying to do is obviously have some form of agreed process, some agreed form of arrangement that goes right into the future. But of course, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't see into the future. And families themselves, the dynamics in families have changed. And allowing flexible structures to work with the way that families change must be really quite important, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, as I think we've just been hearing, it's about cohesion. And I suppose when you look at perhaps not just the families that we represent today, but what the makeup of families are likely to become. The nuclear family, does that really exist now? The nuclear family, less binary than it was before. So when you look at your second, third, or fourth generations now, you've got a much broader family base. And I suppose the other thing that is a common theme is around actually what is the wealth. And it's not so much around what is going to be inherited, but it's actually what generational legacy is being left to the next generation, coming back to that sort of conversation around sort of purpose and rationale. And actually, interesting on one side, you would have thought that some of those conversations might have been more sort of conflict, but actually, for many of the families that we're talking about, it is a common theme and a common problem that all generations are conscious of and want to solve together. And to some extent, I think it depends on how the wealth is held or generated. Eric, you may have a different view about this, but as an example, as a family operating business may well have a better success of the cohesion around a family if it is part of the long-term planning of a family to keep that operating business going. It allows broader family members to participate in that. But also, I suppose, in the current climate, it's the sort of things that families with operating businesses need to address the commercial issues head on when it comes to climate change and it comes to expectation and delivery of expectation of employees. So all of a sudden, as I say, coalescing around a family operating business actually then starts to realize again family values, and we may come onto it, but the often used expression of value versus values, and actually what the purpose is, and again it's purposeful. So I think when it comes to cohesion, yes, there's lots of different tools that we might come across, be it family charters or roadmaps for the family, but very often it's the type of asset base, or if it is an operating business, that's an excellent vehicle that has longevity to assist with that. But what the relevant issues are for each family, depending on what they look like, I think families are going to be changing, and I think the issues are going to be fascinating to unfold. And so the extent to which you can influence the changes of the law to cope with those changes is going to be fascinating to see.
Or whether it's a change of law, whether it's getting families to sit down and talk. Often if your first generation is the wealth creator, that person is often quite a strong character, and trying to encourage them to think about some of these issues and engage in debate with the family as opposed to imposing on the family a structure, I think that's challenged, and that's where the soft skills that private client advisors absolutely need.
And another example, if I may, when it comes to the traditional versus perhaps the modern, is reading various reports over the last 6 months or so that a number of the UK landed estates families, they are becoming Britain's biggest house builders. They are, within their communities, and in particular rural communities, now building hundreds, if not thousands, of homes. And in a way that, you felt that was a sort of a dying breed, but actually they are reinventing themselves and creating a new purpose, and probably, small villages with a real soul. It's a real purpose, and things that family members can actually get behind and feel proud about.
I think if I may, we out of the $1 billion that we manage, we have $500 million that comes from family offices, and they come from probably 25 different countries. And one common theme on the families we have, and it's an easy product for family office for us because we're a tech fund, so all the young stirring the families really love the investment made into our fund versus real estate or any traditional business that they find boring. So I think from that point, we have an interesting product, and we're at the forefront of the new innovative families. But one thing that is common to all of those families that all have different structure is the purpose. The new generation really want a purpose to that investment. And it's not only ESG, that's one of the aspects, is they want something that is palatable for what they live, what they are engaged. And the successful families I've seen are the one, and there's many models. Again, there's the old traditional model that you brought your kids in a way that they're not engaged, they don't need to know that they're wealthy, and one day they receive a check and they understand this a bit remotely. And that's the old traditional ways. The new way is from 10, 11, 12 years old to start to engage them into what it is to invest in stocks. Now I know that what it is a prenup. So I have 2 daughters, so now I just discovered that. That's something I'll remember for the future. But I think it's to engage them into that process, into what the family purpose is, and how investment is made. And then there's different scenarios. There's the trust, there's the companies, there's the operating companies that you've just mentioned. But the one that work well is when you see the family being engaged. They might have advisors, they might have representatives, but they are engaged, and we end up pitching to a family on Zoom call these days, but you will pitch to like 20 members of the family what you are doing, and then they have there are a series of questions that they will ask manager like us, and then you answer each of the question, and then you have specific meetings with each of them, and you can see that those models work, and they are creating multi-generational structures that are, I think good in the long run, and then this is where you see the ESG coming in. This is where you see the purpose and the engagement of the families into creating those long-term structures, and that's what we've been experiencing on our end.
Because one of the things that we've been talking about in our discussions is it a difference, or is it actually more similar than you think? The use of the term purpose and the use of the term value. Do you apply a values-based focus on your investments, or is it a purpose-based focus on your investments? Is there really a difference? And how is that dealt with in the context of impact investing and ESG? Sophie, I think you've seen differences in attitude between a value-based approach and perhaps a purpose-based approach.
I think it all comes back to the term legacy, the vision, the purpose of the family. What's the purpose of the wealth? And you can split it into 3 main strands. The first is around philanthropy and strategic giving. So how are we going to give money away as a family? And that's a really useful tool, as you said, in educating 12-year-olds on stocks, using philanthropy as a way from a young age to engage the next generation hear their views on money and where they want fund, where they want resources to go. So philanthropy is one piece that meets what is the purpose of the family, big rise in humanitarian causes and cost of living causes in the last year or so. The next is looking at sustainable investment, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the climate transition is estimated at needing anywhere from $2 to $7 trillion a year to solve these issues. Huge amounts of money, and so a lot of investors are looking at this and saying this is a really great future investment opportunity for us because this is where the flow of capital is going to go over the next 5 to 30 years. So we see investors looking at, for example, a climate tech business, because that's what, from a fiduciary perspective, from a returns perspective, they think that is going to be the best investment for them going forward. And it's particularly interesting with the next generation, if they feel that their role in the family is to prove themselves and to prove that they can add financial value, they may be looking at these kinds of businesses as well. And the positive impact side is a byproduct of this focused on the returns. And then you have a whole other group of families who are very focused on, we want to create a positive impact, and therefore we want to go into perhaps the same climate business, but because it's going to do good in the world. And that's a very different lens that you begin to look at investments and finances through. And you often see those kinds of investors with perhaps their more liquid portfolios not wanting to invest into certain sectors from an ethical, from a values piece. And a lot of research says that a lot of investors want to have these very values-aligned portfolios, sustainable portfolios over the long term. But actually, the delta to the number of people who are actually doing it is quite high, because of fiduciary reasons that we've seen, risk return and big drivers that we've seen over the last couple of years. So drilling down into what does legacy, what does purpose mean? Are you trying to create positive change? Are you trying to make the most money you can for your future generations? Or are you trying to just do no harm? Creates very different ways of managing the capital.
And in terms of the type of expertise, advice that families are looking for to guide them in these discussions. You know, for example, they're starting to think about ESG, but they're not quite sure what to do. And as you say, there's still that gap between those that are discussing it and those that are actually doing it. There must be a role for global finance centres in these discussions and for the advisors in those centres. Michael, where do you think, Guernsey in particular, for example, sits in these kinds of discussions? How can Guernsey as a jurisdiction assist?
I think it depends on which optic you're looking at this through. And I suspect we may have a common view, but different views too. So you've got our view, being the Guernsey service provider. You've got the international community view, and then you've got our client's view. I think my view is that we are stewards of vast amounts of private capital. So we need to act with integrity, and we need to create a platform for our clients that is reliable, that's trustworthy, and that it is fit for purpose for them. So we are part of the capital flow ecosystem, and we need to stay relevant. So I think from my perspective, when coming back to the role we're playing, it is very much ensuring that our benign environment allows our clients, one, to have the confidence of that, but also ensure that we've got the products, the services, the solutions to offer them. We're always going to have the international community, which may be looking at us with envy, in particular, because one, we may have a lower tax environment, and we're also domestically a very a comparatively wealthy sort of community. And at a time of austerity and a time of conflict, when many economies are struggling, they're looking at our economy and what we do and questioning it. And I think it's down again to us domestically to ensure that we're conveying the right messages insofar as there are open ears to listen. We were, Eric, having an interesting discussion earlier about the different views of international sort of regulators too. So I think all of that, from a Guernsey's perspective, if we're going to remain relevant, we need to be compliant too, and that's where it helps the international community. And I know that many of us who've grown up through a number of changes in the offshore finance centre industry over 30 years of my career, you see regulation upon regulation upon regulation. You're saying, actually, is this going to be the death of us? The reality is, in order to demonstrate we are good global citizens, we do need to demonstrate that we are above reproach. So that is the cost to serve. That's the cost of us doing business, but it's also the cost of us remaining relevant and part of that capital flow ecosystem.
And perhaps, Russell, you could perhaps go into a bit more detail on the types of structures, the new types of developments we've seen in the island that allow us, as Michael says, to stay relevant, to stay ahead of the developments that we're seeing, particularly in such a digitized world that we're in.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to go off message, because I don't think necessarily it's about new products. I mean, having a new private investment fund regime, is good to go out and win business. But actually, what our clients are looking for in a time of global uncertainty is stability. And when they come to us, they see, what are the tools in the box? Well, there's still the discretionary trust, there's still the foundation, the purpose trust, the family investment company, which is, as we've said, it's just a company. You don't necessarily need to innovate the product. What you need to do is provide the family with the advice that they need around that, and structure the trust of the company, whatever it might be, so that it's relevant to the needs of the family and flexible for those unanticipated changes that you can't see going down the road. Guernsey provides a platform that is welcoming to business for people who want to come to Guernsey. If you ask the people why they come to Guernsey, it is the stability. It's that 818 years of political stability with 5 years gap in the mid-1940s that we don't really dwell on. It's the rule of law. It's the quality of the people providing the services. It's the professional support. It's the judiciary. It's all that. Which, as I say, in times of instability, is what clients are craving. It's not a new type of company or a new type of legal entity, in my view. Having said that, of course, we have just launched the natural capital fund regime, which builds on the Guernsey Green Finance Fund regime that was introduced in 2018, which has been very successful. I think currently they've raised 5.3 billion for funds that are primarily to do with carbon mitigation. But this new regime is trying to attract funds that look to preserve the environment and to try to put a value on things like clean air, clean water supply, and what have you. And then the GFSC have also last week produced new anti-greenwashing guidelines to make sure that people who are claiming to have an ESG product are actually able to demonstrate that they're doing what they say they're doing.
So as you say, a lot of the structures that we advise on day to day, it's not that they're new in themselves, but I suppose it's the regulatory and good governance framework within which they operate that is constantly developing in Guernsey, with ensuring that we stay ahead of the forms of investments in which those structures will operate. And Eric, perhaps we could just end with touching on Tim Peake's theme of looking to the future, looking to new technologies, some of which that he touched upon we've never even heard of yet. How do you see the future form of investment amongst the families, the young entrepreneurs that you're working with? Where do you see us going?
I think that's an interesting question. Thank you for asking it. I think ESG is becoming something that we have to integrate into our investment policies. Having said that, you talked about purpose versus value. We're not an impact fund. We're not a philanthropy, which might have different KPIs. It remains that we need to perform on return. If our funds are not top quartile, I mean, our franchise will disappear over the years to come. So you need now to do this with ESG top of mind as part of what you do. And what we're discovering, and we've been, and I have to flag that Guernsey was instrumental into this, because this is the Guernsey state that, being one of our big institutional, together with the Canadian government, the French government, the German government, the South Korean government, were the first one to tell us that we needed to register it with the UN PRI principle, which we did in 2017, which was a bit early. And being very skeptical, to be honest, at that time, because when you are investing in early stage companies and you need to think about ESG before survival, I mean, this is where you get things a bit challenging. But including this into our investment policies, we in fact embrace it now. And it's actually quite positive. It's positive for the investors. It's positive for the investment we do, for the communication we're able to do externally. And some example we've done, we're one of the largest investors in a mobility company that operate also here called TR Mobility. So we're just changing the way you travel across cities. This is now the leading firm in Europe. We are also investing in a firm in Canada called Work that is providing a software solution to large corporate in order to implement ESG more efficiently into their companies. We even invested in a dog food company. Some of you might have dogs called Butternut Bucks here, which in fact is creating food that is organic, of very good quality for your animal, extending their life line by 40%. So you can invest in technology, you can invest in very fast-growing companies. Each of these companies I've mentioned are now worth billions of dollars, and that was done with us integrating ESG. So ESG doesn't come against return. I think it just changed a bit the way you approach return in investment now. And I think families, going back to the purpose I was mentioning, are really embracing this and finding this extremely interesting. And that become part of your DNA, part also of your sourcing, to have a very clear strategy and team dedicated to this. So one last point, we just recruited a director of sustainability in our team. This is not something that you would have seen 5-6 years ago. We're 15 in our team, but now we have someone specifically dedicated to this that every year will produce, in addition to our report that talk about a return, about the numbers and so forth. We have this very detailed 40-page document that explain through a list of KPI that we were inspired to by the UN PRI that really explain how impactful we are with those investments that generate return. But it doesn't go against return. And that's a very important aspect to bear in mind, because at the end of the day, those families, if you want the young generation to be supported by the older generation that invest with those traditional type of approach, you need to come with some good returns.
Show me the return.
Yeah.
I mean, there was historically, I think, that there were some trustees who were nervous about ESG investing because of that very fact that, you know, your duty is as a fiduciary to maximize, to preserve and enhance the trust fund. And there was quite a lot of work done by the UN, I think with Freshfields on the 21st century fiduciary duty, pointing out that actually your job as a fiduciary is to, when you consider making any investment, is to take into account all the risks. And actually, if you're not taking into account ESG risks in the investments you're making, that itself is probably a breach of fiduciary duty.
There's been quite an interesting legal case in the UK in the last couple of years, a Charities Commission case, Butler Sloss versus the Charity Commission, where two climate-focused charitable foundations were focusing entirely on divesting from assets that did not align with the Paris Climate Agreement. And the Charity Commission said, when you're not meeting your financial return target. And so and the foundations won and really opened the lens, certainly for the charity world, that you're able to consider these non-financial factors, which is really important, I think, for people to be able to consider what is right for their organisation, for their family, for their trust in terms of finance versus climate versus ESG.
Which isn't really surprising because it's been recognised that your duty as a trustee is to act in the best interests of the beneficiaries. The courts in the Channel Islands, in Guernsey, have long recognised that benefit is not limited purely to financial benefit. It's to discharge moral obligations and other things that are for the benefit of your beneficiaries, and having clean air for future generations is quite a good benefit.
And actually that leads me nicely on to a couple of questions that we've been receiving through Slido, actually. So touching on the fact that actually benefit can have a much wider meaning, and the fact that actually consideration of what is a benefit will often change with the times. And we've seen, a great deal of upheaval over the last couple of years, to the point where actually perhaps succession planning is not the only form of benefit to a structure. Perhaps there's other kinds. Sophie, are there any changes in mindset that you've seen as a result of some of these macroeconomic issues arising, for example? Is there less of a focus on succession planning in light of, for example, rising inflation, for example?
I think one of the main things that we've seen this year, which I think that is that there are always macroeconomic issues. I think the last year, and certainly this year, is probably one for the history books with the amount of geopolitics and macro issues that we've got. But multi-generational families are long-term. They are used to dealing with these big kinds of issues. So where you've got good governance and good structure, and a family's listened to all the great advisors into this room and set themselves up really well, they can deal with these kinds of issues. They know how to deal with the tensions that are cropping up at the moment. And I think it's our role as advisors to help to remind them, perhaps if they haven't done their succession planning, to remind them it still needs to be done and to support them through these periods. But a long-term family will be able to deal with these shocks, and that's how they've managed to stay successful for this long. I think the big shift I've seen this year is the change in focus on sustainable investment. We had a huge run-up in 2019, 2021, particularly in liquid markets and valuations. A lot of more climate-related stocks are very long-term, growth-orientated, so they've been hit very badly by, the price has been hit very badly by sharp interest rate rises. But again, these are long-term themes, and long-term families are seeing buying opportunities within there. So rather than get worried that and we've seen energy the US energy sector's up 70% this year. So a sustainable fund probably hasn't performed as well as it did in the last couple of years versus, and this year's really underperformed. So a long-term family will should be looking through these issues and thinking climate change is a long-term structural trend. As I said earlier, we've got this shift of a huge flow of capital that's moving that way, and other sustainability issues. They can see buying opportunities at the moment. So I think where people are taking proper advice, and we as advisors have a responsibility to remind them of some of these issues and educate them on, even when there's a lot of other things going on. The key pieces aren't falling away, but it's just more pressured around the time frame that they're able to do them in.
I think if I may on this question, because to me this is one that I'm living full on at the moment. I have no doubt that rising inflation and the current market tension will put a weight on the money that is allocated to impact fund versus fund like ours that are forcing ESG as part of the investment policies. I mean, the period of easy money, the period of you make so much money that you don't know where to invest it, so you feel super philanthrop, you want to give to everyone around. It worked well before this crisis we're living since 6 to 9 months. But I think now people will go back to purpose, but purpose with a return. And I think it would be interesting to see in 2 to 3 years where the market is. But I think it would be challenging for impact funds that are not making sure to have returns that are superior to inflation. And you can have an impact and a good return. I don't think that's impossible. But to have an opportunity to force less the return because you're just having an impact and you could lose money and it doesn't really matter because anyways you do something good based on other KPIs, I think those times might have evolved now. That's my feeling.
Sticking
At
with,
least that's what I'm being told by people around us.
sticking with the investment theme, but from a different angle, which I know a lot of people have been asking about. We've been asked the question, does new technology, for example, crypto, open up new opportunities for the next generation, or is it too volatile as an asset class?
I guess that's probably for me, this question. we have 200 million in this sector, so we have an open-ended and closed-ended strategy, and we don't call it crypto, we call it digital asset. So that's a mix between metaverse, DeFi, which is decentralized finance, and Web3, which is the new version of web. Some of you might have heard this term. I think no doubt it's really disrupting the way things are consumed. I can see in a few years these two asset class, i.e. digital asset and traditional VC, if there's any such thing as traditional VC, merging. I think it has changed tremendously the way people are storing their asset, the way people are moving asset from one country to another's. I think that's clear. But also the way payments are done within gaming, the way payments are done in the art sectors, and the way you're able to digitalize products in a way that make them very movable. And I think one of us was talking about family offices moving across jurisdiction and being very, very savvy at shopping for the best place to go. I think digital asset is just exceptional for this in terms of allowing you to move your asset quite fast. And one of the reasons why we have to have segregated strategy, and there's almost like a new world in digital asset versus the traditional world, like in banks, it's very tough to get this on board. When I say on board, I mean to get accepted to trade with HSBC, but a lot of other banks, I mean, it's all like this, and it's just normal, is that you can't trace the KYC AML in an appropriate way. And in a world where you really need to know where the money is coming from, where there's money flowing from a lot of challenging countries at the moment, it is very tough for the large traditional institution to accept that product. But that product is likely to be the leading one for a future platform, and that's why we're very keen to invest in it. And I think Guernsey has done some good work into this, and I think they were able to get some fund accepted and licensed into the island, but they're doing it in the right way. I think that's where it's important with family offices. I'm not going to name it other jurisdiction, but I don't expect Guernsey to have any challenge in being caught off guard with money that should not be accepted into any regulated fund in Guernsey, because the regulator is quite tough, to be honest. I think that would, but for good purposes, for good purposes.
And perhaps looking at it from the trustees' perspective, still on the same theme, the risks associated with investing in digital assets, for example, or even still the question of sustainable assets. I know we've touched upon recent case law that might give more comfort, and recent reports that have been prepared may give trustees more comfort to invest in sustainable assets. But do you think there's any need, any requirement for any legislative changes? So the question we've been asked is there, do you agree that any form of amendment to the trust law may be needed in order to provide trustees with the confidence to invest sustainably? But I suppose that could also apply to investing in digital assets.
On the question of whether the trust law needs to change, I think our trust law is certainly broad enough already in that any form of property can be held upon trust. The question, of course, is, and I draw a distinction between cryptocurrencies and other forms of digital assets. There is still academic debate about whether cryptocurrencies are property rights. I'm told by my children that I'm a dinosaur, and I'm sure I am. But because I'm a lawyer, I have to look at the risk, and cryptocurrencies, they're extremely volatile. I know they're here to stay, and they're not going anywhere. But at the moment, from my perspective, they're extremely volatile. There are questions about where those assets sit in the world, and we're still living in a world where taxation, particularly estate tax, is based on where assets are situate. If you happen to die, on holiday in Miami Beach with your key in your pocket, is that a US citus asset for estate tax purposes? I don't know. So for me, I think that there are certain issues that I think will need to be resolved, but I don't think it's necessarily a legislative change. I think the world just sort of needs to agree, what are these assets? Where are these assets?
That's the LT debate, is that we have different views on this. Luckily, the pound is not volatile, so that's very protected.
But Russell, could I ask, in regard to, say, the trusts law, whilst it may be broad enough, do you think that having clarity around specific asset classes or ESG in particular would help encourage people to find a route where they may be confused as to whether there is or isn't an option? Because I think one of the things that we often struggle with, as we say, looking at the traditional view of what we ought to be doing, as opposed to perhaps accepting what a broader 21st century fiduciary duty exponent might lay out before you. But I think what we've often, from a Guernsey perspective, done is perhaps to repackage things so that there's greater clarity about what you can and can't do, because we as either trustees or practitioners revel in the ability, the architecture that's available. We can do anything with the products we've already got, but for many, actually, that's too confusing. If you have something with a label on it, they know you can do it.
There's certainly a marketing advantage in that.
Yeah.
The danger, of course, is whenever you say, for the avoidance of doubt, you can do this, it creates doubt. But yeah, I certainly would not be averse to a marketing change to make it clearer if you thought that was something that, as a jurisdiction, was something we should be thinking.
And at the same time, that's one of the strengths of Guernsey outside of this volatility things. What I would say is that the fact that Guernsey has a very established legal structure that makes sure to protect families, to protect investors, I think it's actually very positive. I don't think there's any value in being the first in class, the first one to regulate it. I think it's just important to probably track what other jurisdictions are doing. I know that the UAE at the moment, they just established passed a new law that is very progressive on this. We'll see how it goes. There's a lot of money flowing from a lot of different jurisdictions that we might question whether or not that's the type of money that they want to have. But it's going to be interesting to see what emerges from that. And I think it's great to be not the first one to adopt it. That I think Guernsey is really good, but be very agile and very open to be one of the fastest jurisdictions to adopt it when it become a bit safer or more established in other jurisdictions. I think Guernsey is well positioned for that.
Regulation is definitely going to come in this space. We know that the OECD is consulting at the moment on changes to CRS to make people report cryptocurrencies. So yeah, I think regulation will be imposed.
But that remain also, going back to one thing, that remain a very small part of the investment that we're seeing in family offices as well. A very small part of the work we're seeing because it's still a bit unclear where it will be. So I think that's important to regulate it, but I don't think Guernsey should be putting all of its energy just into that at the moment. I think there's a lot of other sectors that are prone for great investment that could be very sustainable for Europe and for the different markets we're investing in.
And as I say, I think that there's a difference between cryptocurrencies and other forms of digital assets.
We've had a question here touching on Guernsey specifically and its regulation and the issues we've seen with regulations in other countries. Are there any specific geographic locations that Guernsey is seeing business flow from? So, for example, is the grey listing of other jurisdictions meaning that we're seeing a flow of business come to Guernsey particularly?
I think more so in the fund space, but in the private wealth space, I don't think it's necessarily grey listing that's the issue. I think it's all the things we've already talked about reputational association with certain jurisdictions that perhaps haven't adopted the transparency agenda. it would be unfair of me to name all the jurisdictions where we're creaming business in from, but certain Caribbean jurisdictions may be a source of business.
I think the other theme that we've been seeing for quite some time, and it's around things such as reporting, transparency, possibly reputation too, is families deciding to centre their affairs in one particular jurisdiction. You know, historically, you might have just set up a vehicle for each asset that you might have owned, and it might have been, well, let's go for the cheapest corporate vehicle in some far-flung place. But with the arrival of CRS and having different reporting responsibilities, together with, be it grey listing or other reputational issues, I think many families with these sprawling structures have found actually and in particular those with a US connection, the audit risk is heightened if you have multiple jurisdictions that you're using, each potentially reporting in a slightly different way. So we have definitely found that we have been beneficiaries of that consolidation and also, frankly, simplification. So we spend a lot of time for clients in just restructuring, making it simple, making it more transparent, and in particular if there are aspirations about co-investing with other people so that you're presenting something that actually is sensible and coherent and fit for purpose today.
It's certainly something we've seen, and particularly as you were talking about the nuclear family becoming unclear, sometimes the simplification of structures can allow it to be better preserved in the future. Yeah. One question that we've had, which may perhaps be for Sophie, but of course for everybody, what advice do you have for high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals navigating the changing investment and philanthropic landscapes?
Oh, great question. I think to really take advice and education. I think there's, as we've seen today, there's an awful lot of overlap between these different areas and the terms used. So being able to split out what is philanthropic purpose, what are you trying to do from a values perspective, and what are you trying to do from a return perspective. And I think the sustainable investment market has got very confused with the terms ESG, ethical, impact, responsible, values. People use them in very, very different ways. And a fund which uses ESG input, so let's avoid companies which have the worst governance risk or the worst environmental risk, aren't necessarily companies which are creating positive outcomes and doing good in the world. You may say that Tesla is a great company because it's still creating electric vehicles, which we think will help with climate issues, but you might say it's a terribly ESG company because it may have poor governance issues, as an example. So that's why taking advice and understanding really what you're looking to do under the bonnet is quite key. And we're seeing a lot of regulation coming down the track to help with this. So we've had MiFID II, Articles 7, 8 and 9. We've had the Guernsey greenwashing regulation last week. The FCA in the UK has brought out a whole new range of sustainable fund definitions. So I think there's a lot on the regulation side. So investors need to take a step back, really think about what they're looking to do and take advice on these different areas and really drill down onto the bonnet of what the purpose of that particular type of fund is. Are you looking for return? Are you looking to minimize downside risk? Or are you looking to create positive change or create upside on the portfolio?
And Eric, we've had a question. From an investment perspective, what common issues do you see families and investors needing to overcome at the moment? What issues are you seeing families and investors needing to overcome at the moment? Are there particular issues that you're seeing crop up with investors?
I think one of the issues, it's an issue based on where the market is. I think a lot of the families have been overexposed to capital market, and I think at the moment they're, you know the old say that when you are losing on the market, you become a long-term investor into this. So a lot of these investors are stuck into positions that are pretty low in the market where there's little direction at the moment. And I think it's one of the things we're doing with many of them at the moment is sitting down with explaining what is our strategy as a closed-end fund, and how do you invest part of the money now into longer-term investment, understanding that you might have less liquidity, but you have a clearer path to growth. And I think at the moment with these last 5-6 years that were very similar to the year 2003 to 7, 8 that we've seen, I think people have to go back to the basic of macro allocation between alternative, between listed, between cash. And there's a lot of confusion into this and a lot of disagreement between the old generation and the new generation. And that's one of the things I'm seeing at the moment as really core, where the old generation go back to what they were doing, either on the operational business or they get out of the market and they got burned and they don't want to go back for 10 years. And the new one is saying, no, let's look at scientific analysis and how to do investments. And this is where our role become quite interesting. And I think that's one of the big struggle we're seeing at the moment is for them to define how to approach this new world. And it's a real new world. And the other thing that comes on us as well is that a number of you are familiar with the hurdle rate that you have in your fund. I mean, private equity is typically at 8%. We are at 6% roughly. In the US, they have no hurdle rate in our sector. Now with inflation at 7, 8, 9, 10%, I mean, the level of return you have to deliver for absolutely appropriate reason has to increase. So I think that's one of the challenges we're also seeing where people saying you're just going to do 8% preferred return. I mean, it's a pretty big return to provide. But when you have 10% inflation, it's absolutely legitimate for us as general partners to try to find ways to get there. In addition to ESG, so it just shows you the type of environment we're in. So it's for families, but it's also for general partners. How do you position yourself into this new environment? And it's a clearly new decade that we're entering.
So we've probably got time for one more question. We've only got a couple minutes left. What is the first step that a private client advisor can do to help their clients understand investable opportunities available and also deliver on ESG? That's the question.
Sophie.
Come and talk to me. I think educating ourselves is really important. There's a lot of courses out there. There's a lot of things that you can do online to educate yourselves on how to look at the sustainability aspects. And again, it drills down to what are you particularly trying to do? Are you trying to create a specific goal through illiquid assets, or are we doing this through liquid markets? Then they're very, very different ways of doing things, and they'll achieve very, very different aims, objectives, financial return, and some sustainability return as well. So really understanding, are we looking at liquid and illiquid markets and getting used to the nuances between those. But I think education, taking advice as you know, I'm always learning, taking advice from other advisors and taking time to sit down with your clients and think strategically about sustainability as a family. So Michael and I were talking earlier about, certainly me with families, I go and say, we need a particular session on sustainability. Let's think about the risk of it to your business. Let's think about the risk of it to your home. So, for example, if it's a coastal home, you might not be able to get a mortgage in 10 years. Think of it about the location that you're in. There are certain places, the locations that you might be located in. Let's think about the investments that you're doing. So think about sustainability risk as a family, and then you can begin to pick off the different pieces over time and take advice in appropriate areas, because you'll just won't be able to do it all in one fell sweep. You can't do it at the end of an annual review meeting. Let's think about this as a strategic long-term risk to the family, and it's a multi-generational thing. If we're thinking about assets for generation 3, 4 generations down the line, we need to consider about the risk of that now.
Could I also just sort of add, I think that whole education piece too, because certainly when looking at the private wealth or the trustee side, you're right, that the lexicon of terminology still is very confusing. And whilst the PRI and the investment industry is already there, it needs to embed these things. On the trustee side, we still struggle, with all these sorts of debates. But coming to your point about the 21st century fiduciary duty, I'd implore people to look at a new piece of research that the International Institute of the Channel Islands published last month about that, trying to pick up the work that Guernsey Finance did and published last year around around where to start and just trying to simplify it as a sort of a three-step process. And I think that sort of educational piece will allow us to be better informed. And again, it sort of comes back to our responsibility as custodians, and it's raising that agenda point to our families to inquire, to be inquisitive. But if it's not on the agenda, why not?
So we've got time for probably one last quick question. For high net worth and ultra high net worth investors looking at the Channel Islands, what makes Guernsey stand out? The Channel Islands and the Isle of Man is actually your question.
The quality of the people. I mean, it's true. I mean, it's trite, but it's true. The legislative regime in Guernsey is modern, it's flexible, but so are the regimes in other jurisdictions. What sets us apart is our people.
I can say I moved to the. I'm part of the clients there that moved to the. I moved to the island in 2011, and it's partly for that. But my wife and I, we were having a young child at that time that was 6 months old. Now we have 2, and I think the legal regime, the geographical position of the island, which is very close from Paris, from Switzerland, from London, is very, very good. You have civil law and common law that is known by most of the people on island. You have excellent services when it comes to accounting, when it comes to fund administration, when it comes to protection, wills, and it's true. It's a very nice island to live in. So that's one thing I've experienced myself into it. It's a beautiful island, but it's an island full of simplicity, and with simplicity in a good sense, the sense that you can go there, your family will be safe, and you'll be really enjoying what you've built in a nice way, while being able to build businesses and build companies and do it with an international perspective. That's at least what brought me there 11 years ago, and now I'm receiving in December my Guernsey passport. So it just shows that I was convinced of that.
I think, wrapping all of that up, actually, it's people should know what to expect, and it's the consistency. And I think as long as we maintain that, then we will remain of value. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I'd just like to say thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you to everybody for attending, and put our hands together for our panel.
So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Catherine, Sophie, especially you, Eric. What a great advert for the island. Thank you very much indeed. Russell and Michael as well. Well, that's almost it for today. All that remains is for me to thank you all. Thank you very much for coming today. And also to our keynote speaker, to Tim Peake. I'd like to thank our panellists again and our sponsors for their valuable support. And of course, the team at Guernsey Finance, who've done a fantastic job at putting this event on. Thanks also again to our media partner, the Financial Times. I hope you found this afternoon's session as inspiring and completely insightful as I did. It's clear that Guernsey's long track record and proficiency in all aspects of private wealth management cements our position as a true world leader in the global financial services landscape. If you'd like to know more about our expertise in wealth management, please visit weareguernsey.com. Before you leave today, we'd also be delighted if you'd let us know a little bit of feedback about what you thought today of today's event, so that we can make the events even better in the future. Simply leave your delegate badge in one of the boxes on the way out of the building. And then finally, please mark in your diary for our next flagship event, which is the Guernsey Funds Forum, which will take place at Bishopsgate, again here in London, on Thursday, the 11th of May, 2023. And now I'd be delighted if you join us upstairs for the drinks reception. Thank you very much, and have a great evening, everybody.